So the face-to-face off with Jake Paul and Nate Diaz was just ended, and I just got back from a bike ride, and let's talk about it. So basically, there were two discerning factors during this whole entire interview. There was Jake Paul, the person who was super intrigued. He was very ready for the interview. You could tell he was the lifeblood of the interview with his energy and his intensity. And then there was Nate Diaz, who he's Nate Diaz. He's not going to stay for any type of interview. So, and that's not a bad thing on him. That's just him and his persona. We all love that. We all enjoy that. And so we're going to talk about that for a little bit. But first off, I need to start with this. Why did they have to have Ariel Helwani on the show? Why did they have to have him asking the questions? I get he is a big name and he sometimes has some really good questions to ask. But he is the one guy I don't want to be doing this presser between Jake Paul and Nate Diaz. He's the type of guy to be asking these open-ended questions that if you just listen to and you answer, it sounds completely different than what it should be. Like, he asked Nate Diaz, like, do you feel as though the fans are against you in this? And if you were to lose, would you be losing more than just the fight? And he was like, what do you mean by that? Like, he had to reiterate so that Ariel would then finish the question. Because if he was just like, yeah, I feel like losing the fight, it's something that I can't do, the whole narrative would be spun around. And that's the one reason I don't like Ariel Helwani. Ariel Helwani has done that type of stuff with multiple fighters. Jamal Hill, Glover Teixeira. He's done it with Dana White himself. Like, there are multiple times where Ariel has just kind of been the reporter and been with the fighter. And he's kind of been a little bit of both. Nate Diaz could see it. Nate Diaz could see right through that. That's why he was not interested. As soon as they had entered the room, Nate Diaz and all of them sat down. He grabbed the chair and instead of facing straight at Jake Paul, he turned to the side. He was not interested in this at all. Like, the way I'm talking to you guys, like, you guys wouldn't be intrigued if I did it like this, but if I'm doing it like this, I'm more intrigued with you guys. Hi, how are you doing? Like, it's a little bit more streamlined, you know? I don't know what to call it, but anyways, Nate Diaz was just, he was Nate Diaz. Like, that's all I can say about it. And then Jake Paul was very focused. He was very intent. They had both agreed on 10 rounds, but Nate almost wants it to be less rounds. Almost knowing that, like, this is not going to be a fight. This is going to be one-sided either way. And I also agree with that point, in that it could go either way. It could either be Jake Paul in the early rounds with his explosive power and his athletic ability, or it could be Nate Diaz with his ring presence and being able to know the geometry of the ring, being able to know where to go, how to move, how to pivot off, slide on the inside, slide on the outside, come with the hooks. Like, Jake Paul is just learning that style. Nate Diaz has been living that style. So it's really intriguing to see the interview of them being face to face and seeing almost the two polar opposites collide together, because you could kind of see after a while they started to kind of, get each other. They were like, okay, I see that this person is like, Nate Diaz realized that Jake Paul was very intense. He was very focused on the fight. But you could almost tell after like 10, 15 minutes in that he was like, okay, so you're kind of talking but you're not doing it in such a way that's hurting. It's more just helping the fight. And Nate just kind of went like, okay, I kind of see that, and I agree with it. They were talking about how, like, a loss in MMA or boxing isn't really a loss. And I agree with that as well. Most times it's not exactly a loss. It's a loss on the record. It's a loss on the night. But you have other nights. And it's that type of mindset. That's why I love people who go 0-1 and then continue into the sport of MMA. Because it's not because they want the glory. They're in it for the sport. And so that kind of opened my eye on Nate Diaz and the fact that, even with, I think it was the 10, 11 losses that he has in his UFC career, in his MMA career, in fact, Like, he's learned from them. He's learned from those mistakes and he's gotten better. Now, the only question is, has Jake Paul learned from those mistakes? And will he be able to then capitalize on the mistakes that he has made before? Before, his defense was his offense was amazing. It was spectacular against Anderson. But in a couple of times during that fight, he would slow down, he would put the hands down below the chin, and then Anderson would, crack him once or twice because that's the type of movement Anderson was used to. He was used to being able to go bop, bop, bop when the hands came down. But Jake Paul then kept the hands up. From there, it went to the decision. Tommy was able to deceive Jake Paul into thinking that his guard was great, and then connecting with body shots, and then connecting up to the top. Now, will Nate Diaz be able to bring that type of pressure that Tommy was able to bring? I don't think so. I think he'll be able to bring the pressure, but not the power. Tommy is a very big dude. He's bigger than Jake Paul. Nate Diaz is about the same size as Jake Paul. They're about the same size. 5'11", 6 foot, 6'1", maybe on a good day if you got some Heelys. Like, there are similarities between the two body styles. The only disparating thing is the fact that Jake Paul is putting on a lot of muscle with that weight. And now I've looked into it, and the weight is 180 pounds, which usually is a little lighter for Jake Paul and a way heavier for Nate Diaz. Like, Nate Diaz has gone to 155 before. Now, that's cutting weight, but he has gone to 155. Jake Paul has gotten to at least, I'd say, like 190 for cruiserweight. Like, he does not drop down that dramatically that I can recall. So that's another factor, is the fact of this being 10 rounds, him cutting all that weight. Will it affect him as the rounds go along? That's another question that will be asked through us. So as the days come along and we're going to see more press conferences, we're going to see more face-to-faces, it'll be more prevalent to see what the styles are going to be. Because if Nate Diaz starts, shying off and everything, it's going to be one of two things. He's either, one, scared to fight, which we all know he isn't, or two, he's going to come out guns blazing on the night and deliver an amazing performance. And with Jake Paul, if he stays on this, like, almost Conor McGregor-esque intensity that he brings, and the fact of not only bringing himself, but the fan base that he has with him, almost like the Jake Army, the Paul Army, driving with him, going against Nate Diaz and the Nate Diaz Army. That's going to be something that's going to be very interesting, especially for the live press conferences. I do want to see the fight. I don't think it'll sell the greatest amount of pay-per-views just because it's one fight everybody's looking forward to. It's not 3 or 4. It's one singular fight at the top of the main card, and then maybe Serrano. Like, I might see that fight. I might not. If I don't, I'm not going to be like, oh my gosh. Because, like, don't get me wrong, women's boxing is great, but Amanda Serrano is Amanda Serrano. Like, if Jake Paul was going up against Ben Askren again, like, I wouldn't watch it. But it's the fact that it's Nate Diaz, and it not only has the name, but it has the value behind it, that makes me very intrigued and interested on how this fight is going to turn out. Now, for my prediction of now who I think is going to win, if I had to put money on it, considering the odds that are on it, because I believe Nate Diaz is a 2-1 favorite, and then Jake Paul is a 130, or no, the other way around. Nate Diaz is a 1-2 underdog, and then Jake Paul is a minus 135, 155. So basically, if you bet $10, you're getting 5 plus the 10. So I would put my money on Nate. I'm going to put my money on Nate. If the line goes any further out, I'm betting on Nate. But if I had a gun to my head and they said you have to pick a fighter, if that fighter loses, you're done. You're getting shot. I would probably say Jake Paul. Because Jake Paul has been working to the teeth to try to make sure that he is ready for this fight. Nate Diaz has been a full-time fighter, but he hasn't had the high intensity, the absolute maniacal pace that Jake Paul has been having over, I'd say, the past year. Like, if I had to say over the past 12 months who has worked harder for this fight, it would have to be Jake Paul. Because Jake Paul knew that this was going to happen at some point. Like, he probably knew after the Tyron Woodley fight that Nate Diaz was going to be coming around the corner. I just need, like, one or two. Whereas with Nate probably never thought he was going to get this until, like, until he signed the contract. And then he was like, all right, well, let's get this going. Like, if I had to guess, it would be either Nate Diaz from round 6 to 10 or Jake Paul from round 1 to 5. Because after about 5 or 6 rounds, I can see Jake just gassing. Nate Diaz throwing the body hooks, pivoting off of his front foot. Because you also have to realize that Nate Diaz was a premier boxer in MMA, but the one fatal flaw that he had was defending the kicks. He would always get kicked out. He'd get tripped out. He would go to the clinch. He'd start dirty boxing. People would knee him to the body. People would start throwing head kicks. That's the only KO loss that he has is against, what's his name? He has a podcast with Big John McCarthy. Josh Thompson. With Josh Thompson. They were talking about it. And, like, I forgot where I was for a second. I have this sometimes. I'm sorry. But I do feel as though Nate Diaz has just got it. He's got it in the bag. Like, in a way, with how the odds are, there's almost like an 85% chance that he would win with the money bet on. But the obvious pick would be Jake Paul because of the size, because of the athleticism. So, yeah, I mean, if anything else does come out, I'll talk about it. Other than that, Toodle pip. Catch you later.